Hi, it's Channan Hansper here, and I'm going to talk about intervallic sequencing in the music of Frank Zappa. Intervallic sequencing is a term I use to describe a compositional technique where the interval distances between notes are predetermined. Although this technique is one of many Zappa used when composing his music, it's interesting because it's an example of structural continuity that can be observed across a number of pieces. It also serves as an alternative means for melodic construction. So let me show you an example. Say you have an interval sequence of 1 semitone, 6 semitones, 1 semitone, and 6 semitones. You would get this kind of sound. Or say I chose 1 semitone, 11 semitones, and 13 semitones. This approach is important because it's different to the conventional way of creating a melody, where one usually creates a melody based on the order of notes as opposed to the order of intervals. We are going to examine the process of arranging interval sequences in Zappa's non-diatonic melodies. Before we start the analysis, I'd like to explain the rationale for my approach to analysing Zappa's non-diatonic melodies. Usually we have a variety of ways in which we can analyse melody. We can look for themes, variations, repetitions, and so on. And in diatonic music, melodies are often derived from specific scales. Even in 12-tone music, there are structural rules we can observe in the analysis that show a consistent form of organization. But how does the analyst approach a melodic form such as this? You could look for motivic tendencies, you could employ 12-tone music analysis with the understanding that it will have its limitations, or you could examine the pitch intervals. The reason for pitch interval analysis is that we know Zappa considered interval distances in both melodic and harmonic forms. We can't be absolutely sure that every melodic form in this analysis was conceived from the organization of intervals alone. However, there are many examples which appear to be strategically organized from predetermined intervallic placement. While not a perfect solution, pitch interval analysis affords us the opportunity to see certain patterns and structures in the music. Although intervallic sequencing will produce a melodic byproduct, the emphasis seems to be on the development of interval sequences, where the melody becomes subordinate to the process. In other words, it shows that the predetermined intervals will shape a melodic line that is somewhat automated by the intervallic choice. In this analysis, examples of the technique are organized into two categories: repetitive sequences and contractive and expansive sequences. A repetitive sequence can be a designated collection of 3 or more intervals, repeated as a group or simple alternation between 2 intervals. In our first example, an extract from I'm Stealing the Room, bar 18 shows alternation between pitch intervals 4 and 2, after which 2 groups of 1-5-5-1 share the same axis. This group is then sequenced at bar 21, followed by 4 group repetitions of 11-3-4, 11-3-4, 2-8. Both alternations and group repetitions appear in Does This Kind of Life Look Interesting to You?, where 3 consecutive groups of 4-1-4, 11-3-11 are contained within 3 septuplet figures, followed by alternating pitch intervals 3 and 5 in the undercouplet. A further example is in the second movement of Bobbin to Crone, where in the selected bars, alternations are grouped together to show transpositions in the 4-1-4-1-4 and 3-1-3-1-3 sequences. In the piano interlude from the orchestral version of Dupree's Paradise, grouped alternations between 7-1-7-1-7 and 8-5-3-2-3 appear throughout. Initially instigated respectively in bars 151 to 152, the groups alternate from bars 175 to 181. A partial alternation appears at bars 155 to 157, and the alternation between 2 and 1 in bars 161 to 162 recurs at bars 167 to 169 and bar 182. In revised music for low-budget symphony orchestra, small groups of interval sequences alternate in bars 156 to 161, starting with pitch intervals 551 and 411-3, progressing to 926 and 1119. Then in the last few bars of the piece, we see iterations of interval sequences 212 and 121. From bars 146 to 147 of Bob Inter Krone, there is a 2-bar repetitive sequence where at bars 148 to 149 it is transposed to T-5. Interestingly, in this particular sequence, reducing the interval distances to modulo 12 reveals a series of interval class 1. In the first movement of Moenhoof's Vacation, a similar observation can be made in bar 63, where the interplay of pitch intervals 11 and 13 can be reduced to reveal 18 instances of interval class 1 within the space of 1 bar. This shows that relatively fewer intervals in reduced form can be subject to greater diversity in pitch space. In its simplest form, pitch space is a sort of backdrop for measuring proximity between notes. The intervallic instability of pitch space diversity creates a certain amount of tension, but also facilitates wider exploration of instrument timbre, since the registral leaps required to perform these type of melodic forms reveals the various characteristics of a given instrument. This ties in with an important yet difficult stylistic quality in Zappa's music, which is essentially exploring the extremities of an instrument or using it in an unorthodox way. Zappa percussionist Ed Mann described the approach in Moenhoof's Vacation. Technically, there's a lot of passages where the notes are going very fast, at 30-second note speed, and there are interval jumps of 9s and 11s all in a row, all up and down. A lot of things from a marimba point of view are almost impossible because you have to be in 2 places at once, operating like 4 hands. The pitches and the tonality are all torn apart. It's all very disjointed. Continuing with our analysis of repetitive sequences, in bars 25 to 26 of this Bob Inter Krone extract, alternating pitch intervals 4 and 5 can be seen to ascend until bar 27, where a sequence of pitch intervals 10, 5, 6 is duplicated in bar 28. This is another example of the integration of both alternation and group repetitions. A more intricate application of the technique is in bar 29, where interval sequencing is used in a contrapuntal context. In the upper voice in bar 29, E-flat and D-flat are pivotal in 3 instances to the notes either side which descend in semitonal increments, say for the notes C to D. Interestingly, while the E-flat and D-flat stay fixed, the interval distances between the first and second, third and fourth notes of each 4-note semiquaver group diminish: 11, 10, 9, and 14, 13, 11. This is a result of the movement of notes around a fixed point. Tracking this line in the same bar is the third voice, where the high B-flat notes are balanced against the ascending notes F, F-sharp, G, while repeated sequences occur in the second and fourth voices. In the second, the sequence is 2-5-7, and in the fourth, 4-8-2, with each 4-note semiquaver set moving upward by a semitone. The first 8-note group of bar 31 is a transposed inversion of the first 8 notes in bar 29. A further observation shows note mapping in bar 32, where the first 3 notes of each 4-note semiquaver group are connected by pitch interval 4. The mapping of pitch interval 4 we have just seen is extended later in the piece at bars 81 to 82. By mapping over the first note of each 4-note semiquaver group, a sequence consisting of the interval unfolds. Carrying out an identical analysis on the second, third and fourth notes of each group again creates a pitch interval 4 sequence. Pitch interval 4 seems to be recursive in bob-and-dacron and is subject to alternations and surreptitious interlocking. In fact, the first 7 bars of the piece exhibit a tendency for interplay of the interval in 2 of the top voices. In bar 1, the second and fourth notes balance either side of the A note pivot, proportion to distances of pitch interval 4. This is repeated at bar 3 as before, maintaining the balance yet simultaneously instigating a progressive semitone ascension starting from the third and fourth notes. A descends to F, A sharp to F sharp, and B to G. In bogus pomp, interval sequences function both as prominent features and embellishments. Towards the end of the piece, there are 3 instances of group repetitions. The first are bars 403 to 407, where alternation between 2 groups plays out. The 2 groups are 11-11-1-4-3 and 3-6-11-3-3. In Pedro's Dowry, between bars 89 to 91, 3 intervallic sequences occur at once. In voice 1, 8-11-4-11, voice 2, 11-5-9-18, and voice 3, 3-4-6-3-1. If we review these examples, we notice a consistency in the exchange between 2 intervals. These exchanges go from 2-1-2-1 alternations in Dupree's Paradise and revised music for low-budget symphony orchestra, to 3-1-3-1 and 4-1-4-1 in bob-and-dacron. With a long succession of 3-2-3-2 alternations in bogus pomp, and smaller ones in both I'm Stealing the Room and Does This Kind of Life Look Interesting to You, showing 4-2-4-2 and 3-5-3-5 respectively. Another observation is in the group repetitions where pitch intervals 11-3-4 are recursive and transformed. 11-3-4 is in I'm Stealing the Room and appears as a rotation 4-11-3 in Does This Kind of Life and revised music. It is augmented in bogus pomp with the addition of pitch interval 1 becoming 11-1-4-3. Pitch interval 11 is a common interval in Zappa's non-diatonic music and appears across numerous pieces in various melodic contexts. For example, in bebop tango, it forms part of the initial cell that is fragmented and recapitulated throughout the piece. In Pedro's Dowry, it emphasizes the angularity of the selected phrase. In this Moe and Herb's Vacation extract, it proliferates across the 3 beats, forming a symmetrical group of pitch intervals 11-1-11, which move up a semitone on the 2nd beat and is an inversion on the 3rd. The main signature melody of The Perfect Stranger is written in a way that balances itself by augmentation and diminution of interval space, with pitch interval 11 playing an important structural part. And a short extract from Gregory Peccary further exemplifies common usage of this particular interval. In fact, if we go back to 1958 and take a look at one of Zappa's early compositions, Waltz for Guitar, we see a further example of pitch interval 11 proliferation as well as its inversion, pitch interval 13. Contractive and expansive sequences are made up of successive interval increments in both directions. In Moe and Herb's Vacation's second movement, at bars 14 to 16, Zappa employs the sound mask technique by gradually stacking notes to create a dense block of sound. At bar 14, notes in the violins begin to progressively overlap in the following order: B flat, A, B, G sharp, G, C, C sharp, G flat, D, F, E, D sharp, until all notes converge at bar 16. The sound is dense because all 12 notes are sounded simultaneously and until bar 16 are confined within an octave. It is in these few bars that increments in intervallic space in both directions can be observed. The B flat is the starting point, followed by repeated semitone descending and ascending movement away from the B flat. If observed in this way, B flat is followed by a semitone ascent to a semitone ascent to B, and so on. But in typical Zappa fashion, the potential for a complete symmetrical pattern is interrupted at the note G, which would be C if full symmetry were intended. However, persevering with this observation, if we take the G and C notes together as being the starting points for the remaining outwardly dispersed notes, from the note C the dispersion is ascending and from G descending. Absolute pitch symmetry is less frequent in Zappa's compositions. However, symmetrical fulfillment takes place in this excerpt from The Adventures of Gregory Peccary. Here, intervals are centered on an axis, which disperses pitch intervals 1, 3, 5, 7, 9, 11. This shows a uniform expansion of intervals where on the first note of the bar, hovering around the G-sharp axis, is an outward dispersion of equally expanding intervals. Contractive and expansive sequences are consistently developed at designated points in the first movement of Bobbin to Crone. The first instance of this is in bars 11 to 12, where expansion begins from pitch interval 1. A gradual interval contraction can be observed at bars 19 to 20, beginning on the second beat of bar 19, with pitch intervals 9, 8, 6, 5, 4. At bar 39, an ascending line progressively expands its intervals from 1 to 8. The line continues in bar 40, this time descending from pitch interval 7 to 3. Bar 48 is another example of progressive expansion of 1, 3, 4, 5, 7, 8. A more uniform deployment is found at bars 59 to 60, wherein the same intervals contract and expand from 1 to 8, and then from 8 back to 1. Essentially, this palindromic interval sequence is a T1R of T0. Bar 65 is a transposition inversion of bar 63, while bar 67 is a transposition of bar 63. The binding elements in these sequences, other than the fact that they show progressive interval contraction and expansion, are the actual pitch intervals, which for the most part fall between 1 and 8 ascending and descending successions. So why are intervals important in Zappa's music? Well, Zappa spoke of intervals as having energetic characteristics, and that certain combinations could affect the listener in different ways. He realized that depending on the type of intervals used, you could determine the type of response, both psychologically and physiologically. In 1987, Zappa gave an interview in which he explained that there are certain harmonic climates that you can build. There are certain notes of a scale that you can play within a harmonic climate to wreak pathos, and it's very predictable. The timbre is involved too, and the amplitude is involved. There are certain frequencies that affect your body and make you do things. Those frequencies too are conveying information that transcends the musical information. They're being perceived physiologically by parts of the body in ways other than just what your ear is telling you about music. The way sound works and the things that it can do to you is fascinating. I've done research into this and I've come up with some things I've used in my work. Another interesting observation I like to add to this is that a few years back, Zappa percussionist Ed Mann told me that Zappa's father had created a table of mathematical ratios and that certain characteristics were associated with each one. Zappa intended to use these ratios in his music. The way Frank explained it to me is that these intervals 2, 4, and 5 are resonantly strong, whereas thirds are weak. Once a strong foundation of the chord is established, sevenths and ninths take on new meaning. I do not know the ratios, and Frank did not speak of the ratios, but he did bring his father's writings out for me to see and showed me interpretive examples on the piano. Emphasis on intervals came from his interest in the music of Varese.
One of the reasons why my music wound up sounding the way that it does is for the whole idea of what melody is. There are many people who can listen to Varese and say, well, there's no tune there, but I hear melody in Varese, and I hear the intervals that he uses, I hear as melodic intervals.
Zappa also implemented serial procedures in his work, which explains why we see intervallic inversions, retrogrades, and mapping.
I write serial music. It's just that I have a different parameters that I'm serializing, that's all. The serialization that I use is a tool, not an ultimate end. That, in order for your piece to be right, that the serial pedigree has to be there. And basically, when it's done, it has to be something that I enjoy listening to.
So if you use some serial procedure and you don't enjoy the result, you feel free to make some modification or obviously edit in order to get something that you like.
Yeah.
This may explain why some melodic forms show symmetry in other pattern-like formations, which are instigated and then abandoned. This is because of what starts out as symmetrical or pattern-like might later on require adjustment once Zappa had actually heard what he wrote. It is entirely possible that some of Zappa's non-diatonic melodies developed from written experimentations. Zappa used different resources for composition. Ideas could be generated from the piano, guitar, or by writing straight to manuscript, with some pieces composed using all methods. However, some compositions are the result of music devised purely from manuscript sketches without the aid of an instrument. In fact, Zappa once explained the process. I can just sit in an airport and write it down on paper too. Some of the pieces to be performed by the London Symphony were written in airports or hotel rooms with no appliances whatsoever. This appears to be the case in some compositions where the musical parts seem unlikely to have been conceived on an instrument, suggesting music composed in the written form.